Hi, I'm Professor Green, and today we're going to be talking about Chapter 9, Regional Economic Integration. So let's go ahead and hop into it. Go through the learning objectives. First, we're going to describe the different levels of regional economic integration. It can be super integrated or not so much integrated. Then we're going to understand the economic and political arguments for regional economic integration, and then the economic arguments against regional economic integration. We're going to explain the history, scope, and future prospects of the world's most important economic agreements, and then understand again the implications for management and how that could affect you in your corporate life in the future. So the opening case is an interesting one because it talks about the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that happened in Asia just a few years ago in 2019. And this was really a result of Trump pulling out of the TPP. They felt like finally now these Asian countries could have enough value, enough power because there was going to be the US was going to be in the TPP. They thought, okay, let's go ahead and start our own. It involves 10 Asian countries plus Australia, China, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. It'll involve 1/3 of the global population. So again, why they have such powers? Because they have so many people in this part of the world and 1/3 of the GDP. The RCEP is designed to reduce tariffs between the member countries and more easily sell the same goods within the bloc. But we'll learn on the next slide that it's not total free trade within all the different countries. It's each individual country having an agreement with another individual country. So just slightly different. The downside, as many people see it, but as China does not, is that China will be the dominant economy. Obviously, China compared to all of these other countries is just so much bigger, and that potentially they could take advantage of having this free trade agreement. But it sounds like these other countries feel like it's worthwhile, mostly because this agreement actually doesn't cover things like services and agricultural products, which are the two things that are so vulnerable to free trade. So let's go ahead and hop into the next slide. What is regional economic integration? This is where the past 2 decades brought in many regional trade blocs. And if you remember, the Doha summit has been stalled now for 17 years. And so as people saw that things weren't moving with all these different countries being able to come to an agreement, they decided then, okay, regionally, we will try and come together with some sort of agreement. So the goal is to reduce or remove tariffs or non-tariff barriers for goods, services, and factors of production. As of 2020, there were 303 regional trade agreements, which is actually a lot. We've heard of NAFTA, we've heard of the EU, et cetera, but there are actually over 300 agreements like that out there. The most ambitious movement towards integration has been the EU, for sure. The United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, the USMCA has replaced now NAFTA, even though it's in essence very similar. Attempts at integration in South America and Africa. This is known as the Mercosur, which we'll again discuss in further slides, but it's a term to be familiar with, especially if you read the Financial Times. And the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is close to being finalized by 15 different nations. So there are different levels of economic integration. This is the free trade area in here where NAFTA does sit. And each of these different rings will have a unique slide, so we'll go into a lot of detail with them. There's the next one. The next goal is the customs union, the common market, the economic union, and that's where the EU sits right now. The EU originally was, down here, I guess you could say, in free trade. Well, informally, when it became the European community, it was already here by the common market, and now it's moved into the economic union. And this is the place of, I guess you'd call utopia, political union, or utopia according to the author of our textbook, where, there are no borders. And the political union that they give an example in the book is the United States, with all 50 states that we have this union and the central government. So let's get into the details as to each one of these. So the first one, that core one, is the free trade area. This is where all barriers to the trading goods and services are removed, but members determine their own trade policies with non-members. So again, it's not necessarily the whole group, but it's individual agreements. It accounts for almost 90% of regional agreements. So very popular model. The European Free Trade Association is the oldest, but it started in 1960. But we should say that actually the EFTA was kind of the forerunner to the European Union. Initially, Britain and Austria, et cetera, a lot of different countries were in the EFTA, but then they left to join the European community. Now, the 4 countries that are left are Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. There are other free trade areas, including, as I said, NAFTA, now replaced by the USMCA. A lot more difficult to say, that's for sure. The next ring is the customs union. This eliminates trade barriers between member countries and adopts a common external trade policy. The EU began here, as I mentioned, and then advanced to that more outer rings. Most countries that enter a customs union desire further integration, so that is really the goal. And right now, the Andean community established some free trade between Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. So if you start to work in those countries, it's good to be familiar to know that they are in this customs union stage. The next stage is the common market. And this is where there are no restrictions on migration, which is a big piece. Free movement of the factors of production. It requires significant harmony among the members in fiscal, monetary, and employment policy. So they have to be in agreement about a lot of major things. And this is where I'm saying Mercosur shows up between Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And if you start to work in any of those countries, you definitely want to be familiar with what Mercosur is, because it obviously allows you different rules and regulations for trade within these different countries. Venezuela was accepted, but then they were suspended in 2006, obviously because of their undemocratic policies in the last few years. Economic union, this is where the EU sits now. The countries are committed to the free flow of products and the factors of production between members. They adopt a common currency, harmonization of tax rates, and pursuit of a common external trade policy. But there should be really an asterisk up here, because as we'll see further in this chapter, the EU is not completely on board with their tax rates, et cetera. But they're in that direction. Most countries are headed there. It involves sacrificing a significant amount of national sovereignty, right? Another word for economic control. So, as I said, the EU is here, but it's imperfect because not all members have adopted the euro. There are differences in taxes, as I said, and there's some regulations still, such as in the energy sector. The last one is the political union. As we said, the United States is an example of an even closer political union. Independent states are combined into a single union. It requires that a central political apparatus coordinate economic, social, and foreign policy for member states. As you can see, right, we have the House of Representatives, the Senate, et cetera, that overlook all the United States. And the EU is headed towards at least a partial political union, if you can believe it or not. Ask my mom and she'd say no way, because she's from the Czech Republic and she feels like she has nothing in common with people from France or Germany. And that she's seen a lot of hurdles when the EU accepted the Czech Republic. But that is the idea, and the author goes into the benefits, obviously, of sustainability and the movement forward of society if there are better free trade agreements. Oh, and one thing I want to say on that last page was that, as I said, the EU is moving towards there, and because actually the European Parliament is elected directly by the citizens of the EU. So that's one of the things that's keeping them moving forward in this direction. So what's the economic case for integration? Why is the author of this textbook so enthusiastic about this? He says that there's gains from free flow of trade and investment between countries, the FDI, can move forward, et cetera. and the WTO will help oversee this. It's easier to form an agreement within a few countries, though, than across all nations. So there's been a push, as I said, towards regional integrations, because the more countries that are involved, the more perspectives that have to be reconciled, and it's harder to reach an agreement. The political case now, as well as the economic case for integration, is that there's more, a little bit more power. So the history that behind the integration is that after World War II and after World War I, Europe was seeing that all these small, different, tiny countries didn't have as much power and influence and value over the United States and the Soviet Union, and that they were fighting amongst themselves, which was a major issue. And so by linking the countries together, you make them more dependent on each other and forming a structure where they regularly interact, and then the likelihood of violent conflict and war will decrease. So there's more communication, they have more things in common. And by linking the countries together, they also have greater clout, as I mentioned, and are politically much stronger in dealing with other nations. So let's move on to the next slide. What are the impediments to integration? So how could it stall? It can be costly, right? While a nation may benefit, certain groups may lose. And this is all about, cheaper jobs offshore. So with the free trade agreement with Mexico, the textile industry, right? I had a friend of the family who worked in thread production, creating thread for sewing in the 1980s in North Carolina. And by the 90s, his business had completely moved out of the United States. So that is where a lot of people say there could be, initial loss. And also a loss in national sovereignty, and that's another word for control, especially over your currency. And this was a major concern in Great Britain, and so why it eventually did withdraw from the EU. So it only makes sense when when the amount of trade exceeds the amount of diverts. And what does that mean? So I'll first give you an example. It means that when the United States goes into an agreement with Mexico and we move textiles and threads and everything like this, clothing production to Mexico, that's great because the labor is cheaper in Mexico and the capital, et cetera, goes farther. But before that agreement, potentially the United States was importing textiles and moving the textile industry to Costa Rica, where it's even cheaper than Mexico. And so then the equation doesn't work. Then the author would say, then we're not creating value. So trade creation occurs when a low-cost producer, Mexico, within the free trade area places high-cost domestic producers, the United States. But trade diversion, which is not good, occurs when high-cost suppliers within the free trade area replace lower cost external suppliers. So this is where Mexico then replaces the really low cost suppliers in Costa Rica. So really important to really understand where these things can potentially go wrong. Let's do one more slide and then we'll take a break and head into part 2. So there is Europe, which has 2 trade blocs. The first one is the European Union with 27 members. Britain has now exited. It used to be 28. And then there's the European Free Trade Association, where my home country, Switzerland, is in. Those 4 members, right? Switzerland, Norway, and Liechtenstein, etc. Obviously, the EU has a lot more power and clout these days. And they're saying that the EU actually is expected to become a superpower like the United States. I'll be curious to think if you think that way too. I'm going to go ahead and take a break here and let you click on the next link for part 2.